state is facing a strong legal challenge to new racial hiring policies. We speak to Sakeliga CEO Piet Roux. Welcome, Piet.
Hi, Chris.
Please give us the gist of these regulations.
The regulations by the Minister of Labour effectively prohibits companies with 50 or more employees to appoint white males beyond a certain level. That threshold varies depending on the seniority and skill level of the employee, but basically it's as low as 4%. It does this by dividing the economy or all possible employees between designated groups and non-designated groups, and it basically says that everybody who's non-designated, those are white males and foreigners, you will be limited. You have a cap on what the proportion is that an employer may employ you at if you're with 50 or more employees, and this must be achieved from September onward within 5 years, according to the department and according to the Employment Equity Act, which was amended in 2023. And just interestingly, these regulations then therefore basically put white men in South Africa as white South African male citizens on the same level as you would a Nigerian or a Zimbabwean or someone from the furthest corners of the earth. You have just as much allowance for being employed as any of those.
So, what is the basis of your legal challenge?
We will challenge these together with our partners Neasa, the National Employers Association of South Africa, because we believe that these regulations are unconstitutional. The Act itself and the regulations are unconstitutional. We do not think that it is an acceptable society, that it is an orderly society, a lawful society, where a state assumes this much power. We consider this an abuse of power and an infringement on the liberties of businesses and of the people involved. We will also challenge it because we believe that it is impossible to implement. The law cannot demand of you to do the impossible. To the extent that one company succeeds in uh, complying with these racial caps, these racial hiring quotas, it will make it less possible for another company to do it. Nowhere in the history of the world has employment across a whole economy reflected the national demographics of such an economy. It always is based on local dynamics, kinship, relationship, skill levels, great variety, and as combined and composed by the discretion of the relevant businesses and the business owners. So we believe it's impossible. To the extent that one company tries to achieve it, it will make it less possible for another. It's impossible for everybody across the economy to comply with this, which means that it is an irrational demand to make the law cannot demand the impossible. And then thirdly, it is harmful. We cannot let the state dictate to companies how they should employ. This is in effect a form of expropriation, because some of these quotas go as far. For example, in agriculture, it says that top management may be a maximum of 2/3 white. Now, in some farms with 50 or more employees, the top management is the farmer. And this means effectively he's already over quota. He can now not appoint his son to manage the farm with him. So it's a very nice sounding way, but in effect a cruel and cool, chilling way of telling a farmer that there's no place for his son on the team. And this is, of course, for farming businesses, but the quotas are even more strict in other sectors of the economy. And so this is, in effect, a form of expropriation, or if you will, targeted economic sanctions on a section of the domestic population.
Why do you call it quotas instead of targets, as it is in the regulations?
We are not obliged to follow euphemisms that the minister or parliament or the regulator chooses. It is a euphemism to speak of numerical targets when the penalty of not complying with this numerical target is 10% of your turnover. And if you don't keep not complying, even if you're willing to pay 10% of turnover every time, eventually you will face contempt of court charges. And after that, you'll be liable for potentially even imprisonment. So this is everything but voluntary. It is compulsory targets with hard caps on what is allowed for, in this case, white males in particular. Now, of course, the Act makes some provision for exceptions. It says that Yeah, you can give reasons for why you couldn't make the quota after 5 years, but every year you will have to report on the progress you've made, and and effectively it turns the whole order of society around. In a free society, you can do whatever you like, as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others, as long as you act properly. But now these regulations, we call them quotas because they turn the whole order of society around. They say if you don't make the numbers we tell you, we the government, if you don't make these racial numbers and these male white numbers, if you appoint more than them, and if after 5 years you've not rectified the situation, then you will be liable for a fine, except if we're willing to excuse you because you ask very nicely. No, this is a quota.
Pete, what do you think young white people will make of this? Do you think it would make them more likely to want to immigrate?
I think this is a very good question to ask of everybody in government, from the president to every other member of his cabinet. Myself, I can only say that the only reasonable interpretation of this is its most favorable, I would say, is that this is a targeted economic sanction domestically aimed at white males. And if this is the state of play, then I'm afraid young white people in this country will look those facts in the eyes and they will judge accordingly that they have a hostile government treating them very badly. Um, of course, that conclusion is not only possible if you're white and male. That conclusion, I think, is the reasonable conclusion if you're any other category of employment, even if you're part of the designated groups. I think the conclusion now is that the South African government has decided to very strictly restrict the economic possibilities of sections of its population, starting with white males. Earlier versions of these draft regulations, they weren't in the final regulations as they were promulgated last week, but earlier versions even included caps on employment for females, white females, but it also included, in some of the earlier drafts, very strict quotas per province for different categories, even within so called generic black groups. So it included a specified quota for Indian, for colored, for black, and so on. Going down this line, which is where government wants to take us now, we end at a position where the end result is a government determining the structure of every social entity. And I think, unfortunately, that is the conclusion that has to be drawn from this. It is most pertinent against white males right now. It's very evident in the regulations. It's very explicit even in the regulations. But I'm afraid that or I should caution that the right conclusion to draw here is that we are facing a government determined to dictate the composition of all entities in society beyond itself. And this is an alarming direction, not only for white males, but for everybody in the country.
What do you think America will make of this, considering its disapproval of our race based laws?
Foreign companies face very big problems under these regulations, and not only because it harms their South African ability to do business, ability to do business in South Africa, but it also exposes them, to the extent that they try to comply, to potential violations of their own legal systems in their own jurisdictions and their own ethical obligations elsewhere. For example, several stock exchanges in the world have, s- uh, as an ethical component, it discourages or even prohibits racial discrimination. And arguably, by conducting yourself in accordance with what this legislation requires now of you in South Africa, you expose yourself to a complaint at another stock exchange. So, let's say a listing requirement, or potentially a legal requirement in your home jurisdiction of being in violation of what is ethically or legally required of you. So, this is a very complicated legal risk vectors opening up to these international businesses. I think this will trouble just the businesses themselves very much. I think we should expect not only the United States businesses operating in South Africa, but other businesses picking up that phone and sending that email to their embassies and trade attaches, asking them how to advise on how to deal with this. This is definitely oil on the fire of South African international trade relations. And well, how else do you explain this as a very targeted sanction against a section of your population based on race and sex? In the US, they call this DEI, diversity, equity, or equality and inclusion, some version of that. And from an international perspective, what's happening now in South Africa looks like the most extreme version of DEI all over the world. And that is where they will categorize this in their legal and compliance risk vectors, in their country risk assessments. And this is also the banner under which they will ask for assistance and guidance from their home jurisdictions. And I cannot see how this can find any favor with the United States administration right now.
Mhm. Hypothetically speaking, if South Africa had a faster economic growth, what would the impact be on skills and the racial composition of the workforce?
Well, the racial composition of the workforce, uh, nowhere in the world everywhere looks the same from company to company. So we must be careful not to set ourselves standards which are utopian, not only in whether they're desirable or not, but whether they're even achievable. But if in a situation of proper economic growth, proper economic policy from the South African government side, we would just see an explosion of wealth in this country. But we're not seeing that. And now we're seeing a squeeze apparently from a regulatory side trying to curry favor potentially with voters, or finding ways in a constrained economic growth environment to try and divide um, basically the existing companies, the existing jobs among a voting base, whereas that is absolutely not a solution. If you were to remove all white males from employment in this country today, you will not make a meaningful dent in the unemployment numbers of this country. So this is certainly not about solving any economic problems. This is certainly not about creating economic growth. What this does do, however, is pit sections of society against each other. And what it definitely does, it destroys, well, let's say not it destroys, but it very much harms the basis by which this economy can grow in the future. Now, I should add before, because I think we're closing toward the end here, this these regulations and this act now by the South African government is an attempt at achieving the impossible. And so, from Sakeliga's side and from Neasa's side, we will use the full extent of legal procedures available to us to uh, interdict and to overturn this. But in a society where, like ours, where an existential threat like this arises, when one must think beyond the confines of just legal procedure, and in reality, the impossibility of what this requires will make of so many companies likely it will make them uncompliant. And whereas in usually compliance was a non-compliance or being in breach of some of these regulations were the exception, I think just because of the sheer audacity, the sheer extent of what is being asked and attempted here, we will see much more non-participation increasingly, and we will see very clever ways of finding ways around these obstructions. So I think I'd like to end this on a hopeful note. Firstly, I think there's lots to be said for opposing this in court. And there is lots to be said for the groundswell of opposition that we will see because of the impossibility, the great harm, and the unconstitutionality of what is being attempted here. So let us be firm and say no to these regulations and continue to oppose them forever and ever until they are overturned or rendered null and void. They are unacceptable.
But just one thing, how can inequality be addressed without transformation that causes um, unhappiness and discomfort in certain sectors of the citizenry?
I'm very careful not to use the word transformation. It doesn't occur in the South African Constitution. It is a specific government policy. And that government policy is that transformationism. It's actually more than a policy. I would say it's an ideology. is to convert every section of society into an image of the state. It is the antithesis of diversity. It is a stifling uniformity that it seeks to impose. I will also be cautious in trying to achieve equality. There is much to be said for inequality. This is maybe a discussion we can have at another time, but also the history of the world and the history of mankind has always shown inequality, differences, variation. Some people are very capable of managing capital stocks, some people are not. And that is why it is very good for some people to be in possession or to have to exercise judgment about the allocation of resources, and others to excel in other domains of society, in the arts, in literature, um, or to do very good work as teachers and so on. We must be very careful to try and say that everything that is not equal, that is not the same, is a problem. But that's something we can maybe get into in another time. But let's not accept the ANC's framing of the problem as one of inequality and transformation. That is not obviously the right frame.
Thank you. That was Sakeliga, CEO Piet speaking to BizNews, and I'm Christine.